On a hot summer day in June of 1947, a civil servant who many people don't know locked himself in a room with a stack of Lord Mountbatten's notes, a tumbler of whiskey, and a pack of cigarettes. A few hours later, he walked out with a proposal that would become the blueprint for the partition of India and Pakistan. His name was VP Menon, and a lot of people probably haven't heard of him. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about his crazy life story and how he ended up in that situation. While names like Gandhi, Nehru, Jinnah, and Mountbatten are often talked about in partition history, Menon often gets forgotten even though he drew up the final blueprint. And his story is honestly quite fascinating because he wasn't born into power. In fact, he was born on the Malabar coast of India, the eldest of 12 children in a family that struggled financially. And according to many historians, after being disciplined by a school teacher, he burned his school down and ran away from home, working several odd jobs and eventually ending up at a coal mine. So how did this boy end up sitting next to the likes of Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the man who would determine the future of South Asia? After working several odd jobs, Menon taught himself how to type and managed to secure a clerical position within the colonial administration, and that way steadily climbed through the ranks of Indian bureaucracy. By the 1940s, he became one of the most influential Indians in the government. And the funny thing is that even though he ended up pushing a lot of the princely states to join India, and ultimately is the reason that India ended up getting a lot of the land, him and Muhammad Ali Jinnah were actually friends in the 1920s and 30s. They apparently enjoyed each other's company and traveled together to roundtable conferences, enjoying wine together and talking about history and politics. On one trip, Jinnah reportedly showed Menon all across Cairo, and at that time, Jinnah was still an advocate for Hindu-Muslim unity. So when we fast forward many years later to 1946, Menon and Jinnah met again, and Menon noticed something different about Jinnah. The politics of India had hardened, communal tensions were rising, and the Muslim League was demanding Pakistan. The Congress Party and the League were unable to agree on a shared future. Menon later wrote that he saw a profound shift in Jinnah's outlook. The constitutional debates that they used to have about protecting minority rights within India started becoming about a separate homeland altogether and a safe haven for Muslims. So now we get to March of 1947 when Lord Mountbatten arrives into the subcontinent with the task of overseeing the shift of power and creating the map that will ultimately determine the subcontinent. But the plans on his desk weren't working. So Lord Mountbatten turned to one of the people he trusted most, VP Menon. Mountbatten handed Menon a stack of relevant papers and asked him to come up with an alternative. Menon withdrew to his room and within the course of 3 hours came up with a new proposal, known as the Menon Plan and later the June 3rd Plan. The plan was simple but consequential. British India would be divided into two successor dominions, India and Pakistan. Bengal and Punjab would be partitioned if their respective assemblies voted for it. Power was going to be transferred much more rapidly than originally thought, and Britain was leaving sooner rather than later. Mountbatten immediately approved this proposal, passed it on to Nehru, who approved it, then passed it on to Gandhi. By the time it was announced on June 3rd, 1947, it became known as the June 3rd Plan, or more commonly, the Mountbatten Plan. But very few people ever remember that it was originally drafted by Menon. But this document would become the first official blueprint for the end of British India and the beginning and the birth of modern South Asia. Obviously, when I profile and talk about these historical figures, I'm not talking about them in a negative or positive way, I'm just talking about their story, and I think it's really interesting that this dropout from Kerala, a former coal miner, a self-taught typist, and an original friend of Jinnah, and he was the man who was responsible for stitching together what is now known as modern India. Few individuals have had greater influence on the map of South Asia, but most people don't really know his name or mention it when they're talking about partition.